Vanport was meant to be only a temporary community, and it was. As the war came to a close and the orders for ships began to decline, families left Vanport as quickly as they arrived. When the war ended in 1945, only about 18,000 tenants remained in the city.
Vanport was not a permanent housing project. It was never intended to be a permanent housing project.
The whole thing was an air of temporary living because everybody who lived there knew that it would be phased out eventually.
But no one was prepared for what happened on May 30th, 1948. Earlier that spring, heavy rains and a late snowmelt threatened the Columbia River Basin with severe flooding. Although the threat of a flood existed, the Portland Housing Authority assured residents that Vanport would be safe.
And the thing that worried me during the early afternoon was the planes kept flying over Vanport, just almost constantly, as if they were monitoring the rising water.
We were on our way up to see the river. A policeman came by on a motorcycle. He said, "Where are you folks going?" And my mother said, "We're going to see the river." He said, "Well, I think you better get out of Vanport as quick as you can." He said, "The dike is broke," and he said, "Vanport's going to be underwater before long."
At 4:17 p.m. on the 30th of May, the makeshift railroad dike holding back the Columbia River broke. In no more than 10 minutes, Vanport was 6 feet underwater.
As it hit those wooden buildings, it tossed them up in the air. Never underestimate the power of water. And they came down in pieces.
And it's just this huge wave, probably about 30 feet high, and it just came in and hit those units and just picked them up like they were little matchboxes. And within 30 minutes, units, people, debris was floating around Vanport.
It was pure horror all the way, looking at the destruction and wondering how many people were being killed.
We're driving along real slow because everybody's walking along, and all of a sudden, my dad saw us. And he came running up. He counted us kids. The first thing he did. And yeah, it was emotional, very, and it still is. I still think about those things.
16 bodies were recovered after the flood, but the final death toll was never really known.
It ended that day, probably around about 4:30, and it ended probably as quick as it went up, in just a twinkle of an eye. And so that was pretty much the end of it.
Portland citizens took in the people who had become homeless as a result of the flood.
But people were very generous. In fact, it kind of caused some breakdown in racial barriers a bit. There were a lot of white families that took in African Americans and others after the flood. A disaster kind of helped in a way.
Portland and Oregon was beginning to change.
I think the attitude that most of the Oregonians who had been in the state and in the city before World War II held was that, just like in many other areas, this was a wartime circumstance that we had to tolerate for the war effort. But as soon as the war is over, we would like to get it back in the old ways as quickly as possible. And they tried to do that without success because once you have the momentum of history pushing you in one direction, no matter how much you might want to go back against the stream, that's not going to happen. So Oregon was permanently changed by World War II, but it was not changed easily.
After the Vanport flood, there were a lot of changes that took place. Everything from the music to the way people talked, sports, businesses. There have always been a few African American businesses, but there are quite a few of them sprang up all over North Portland. So it changed Portland a lot to have that population here. It'll never be the same.
The Portland of the day and its relationship to Vanport is, The circle is closing, I think. Vanport started the process that we are seeing the conclusion of today. So the flood was at the beginning of that process, and we are at the end of that process. And in between, what we saw was a complicated evolution of interactions, sometimes with race the most important factor, sometimes with economics the most important factor, that transformed the city of Portland.
The land where Vanport once stood is now a racetrack, a golf course, and protected wildlife habitat. All that's left is a monument. But Vanport's legacy lives on today.
Oh, the impact of Vanport is here. I'm here, and thousands of others like me, and some a little older than me, some a little younger. We're all here because of the city of Vanport. And despite the flood, we decided to stay because we felt we dug down some roots in Vanport City. And those roots were pretty deep for a lot of people.
We never know what's in store for us. We never know if our house is going to burn down or some storm. I was here during the Columbus Day storm. We never know about those things, but I guess what I always tell my sons is that everybody in this life, all of us, are going to get some kind of a wake-up call. And when it comes, just don't forget to turn the alarm off.